I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a spaceship of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Today, we have something very special for you. After many, many years of requests, we are finally going to do a David Bowie artist deep dive. But before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episodes sent to your device for your listening pleasure. Want to help Velocities in Music grow? You can. Velocities in Music was founded on the idea of creating an enriching discussion about modern music. Please share Velocities in Music with the music enthusiasts in your life. Together, we can move music discussion forward. Major Tom.
Yes, that's me.
We gather here today, many, many miles apart. Like close to 1,500 miles apart. But the internet brings us together. It brings us together from visual... No, nothing visual about this. I mean, I am seeing you. We are over a video call right now.
That's true.
And I finally, you convinced me to buy a microphone of my own so we could have these wonderful music dialogues
I'm glad.
Over the airwaves.
Yeah, man.
Over the airwaves.
This is good stuff. So, wait, if I'm Major Tom, does that make you ground control?
I mean, I've always been ground control, Tom. Let's be real about this.
I feel like that's even more appropriate than that we're like so many miles away. So we're like playing out the narrative. Of space
you're drifting
Oddity.
in space.
Yeah,
in the ether of Boone, Iowa.
That's appropriate. Yeah, it works. Well, I'm glad we're finally doing this because this is a deep dive that people have been requesting for a long time, and particularly since David Bowie's untimely death just a little over 2 years ago, which of course shocked a lot of people. People were very upset about it. It was the height of emotions. Yeah, it was. I remember what I was doing when I found out that David Bowie died. I woke up.
Me too.
I woke up that morning. So here's a little something about my personal life. I don't use an alarm. My wife wakes me up every morning because she gets up before I do, and she starts getting ready for her day, and then she comes and wakes me up.
One would say that you do use an alarm.
It's just my wife.
It's just your wife.
Yeah, my alarm is named Kelsey.
By the way, that's the most expensive alarm you'll ever buy.
That's true. I put a ring on that alarm.
Yeah, you did.
So she came in and woke me up, and she's just like, I think she said something along the lines of, "Guess who died?" And I was like, "Oh God, who?" And she's like, "David Bowie." And I just went, "Why?" And I hadn't even gotten out of bed yet. And my next statement was, he just put out an album like 2 days ago. How could he be dead? And it was a sad morning.
That's a really shitty way to start this podcast.
We're starting at the end. Yeah, let's go back to the beginning.
Let's go back to the beginning. But it's actually I'm just kidding. I think that's a fine way because it tells a story of how we started getting requests about doing a David Bowie deep dive. We were already doing podcasts at the time. We had listened to Black Star. It had come out on Friday, and I think he died Saturday night or Sunday morning. And we had taken a bunch of notes over it because you and I were so excited to listen to Black Star. And I remember when we did that deep dive at the end of that January 2016, we actually just gave our notes. We talked about the album as if as if David hadn't died.
Yeah.
I mean, that was actually really hard to do, especially in context because the album was clearly influenced by his knowledge of his own demise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which changed things considerably. I mean, think about how short a window of time the world had to listen to it outside of the context of his death.
Oh, right. For the most part, nobody did listen to it.
Right.
But that did create this pouring in of requests all about David Bowie, David Bowie. And, Tom, I know that you probably have a much deeper relationship with David Bowie's catalog than I did, at least at the time. I've listened to some of his bigger albums, but I haven't gone through his catalog in detail up until preparing for this podcast. I never listened to his first album before. I had never listened to some of his more non sequitur releases, but in preparing for this, I have been diving into it. So I've been getting the whole story of where he comes from and how he kind of approached writing music and his change in personality over the years as a recording artist, and really kind of just defining what kind of a music legend this guy actually is. Mm-hmm. Because in reality, the reason why people are asking us, hey, do a David Bowie deep dive is because this guy is a legend. Mm-hmm. There's just no doubting. There's no tearing him down from that pedestal. Like, he is a music god.
Yeah. He did so much. I mean, part of the reason I think we stalled on this for so long is because it's intimidating. He has an overwhelming body of work that not only has so much quality, but so much variety that you look at it and it's like, how do I even begin to climb this mountain? Well, we're going to attempt to.
We're going to attempt to now. Are we going to attempt to do this all in one podcast?
No, we're going to split it up into 3 chunks. I mean, where's a logical stopping point in David Bowie's catalog? Because it just continues to flow, right? So
you could do like chronological breaks. You could do personality breaks.
Yeah. But then you're going to have a lot of oddly chunked things, right?
Yes.
You got to draw lines somewhere. So
right. We like our chunks to be pretty uniform here at Velocities in Music.
Yeah. Uniform chunks is my
chunks
motto. I've got it tattooed.
That is actually going to be the name. Well, it's a nice tattoo. That's actually going to be the name of our first album, Uniform Chunks.
No, our first album was A Box in the River.
That's true. The follow-up is Uniform Chunks.
Yes. Okay. So just for everyone listening, so you know where we're doing this, David Bowie has 26 studio albums. That's a lot to take on. We're splitting it up just so we have more even parts to listen to and digest and work through. We're going with his first 9 albums as this first part that we're doing currently, which is going to take us from 1967 to 1975. Crazy that 9 albums in that span of time. I mean, it's just incredible. From there, we're going to go the next 8 albums, which takes us from 1976 through the 80s. And then the last 9 albums will be the 90s, 2000s, 2010s. So the thing is, like, I was thinking about where do we end this first break, right? Because we're going to go up to the album Young Americans, and then we'll start our next one with Station to Station, which I'm like, oh, that's not really the most perfect break. But at the same time, where is in this guy's catalog? Because every album he seems to take some kind of left turn. But at the same time, it always feels like a step that somehow you can relate to what he did previously in certain ways and certain factors. And those factors, those common threads might not always be the same, but they're still there to some extent. So I think we just got to do our best here and just start at the beginning and start trucking along.
All right, Major Tom, you are the resident music historian at Velocities in Music. Tom, David Bowie's first album came out in 1967.
Yeah.
But before that, can you give us a TLDR? Where did this guy come from? How did he get into music? What led him to his solo album?
Yeah, there's still a lot of history, as there is going to be with any artist like this, and we'll try to summarize the important parts. But we're here to talk mainly about his recorded work and the impact that he had, which of course his early stages lead into that, but aren't the most important part. So. From what I read and what I saw in documentaries and articles and so on, he started his musical journey just being very interested in rock and roll music and jazz music. One of the first instruments he started playing was saxophone, which I found interesting, and I think that we'll see that come into a lot of his writing in some of the albums that we'll talk about. He heard some American rock and roll, that started coming into Great Britain. Of course, you had the Rolling Stones and the Beatles starting up. And David Bowie was born in 1947. So you think about him being a teenager when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were coming out, and a lot of that rock music, early rock music that influenced him. But I know Little Richard was a big inspiration to him as well. When he first started hearing this music, it was just kind of an awakening to him because he was always a very bright and expressive child. So he had those artistic inclinations, and I think that he really attached himself to music. Of course, as we'd see throughout his career, he was also able to express himself artistically through other media as well. But in his younger years, he was primarily just playing in a lot of bands, working with a lot of other young artists. I mean, that's where a lot of people start. No matter how famous you become, you have to start somewhere, right? So it's not an unfamiliar story. But back then, he was known as David Jones because that was his birth name. And once the Monkees became more popular and David Jones of the Monkees became more of a household name, he ended up adopting the moniker David Bowie and stuck with it. So from there, as he found his voice and started writing songs, this takes us into his first album, which, if we're just going to dive into the music of this, Jake, I'd never listened to David Bowie's debut self-titled album from 1967 until we started doing this deep dive. And I have to say, when I first listened to it, I thought it was one of the biggest pieces of garbage I'd ever listened to. I mean, I really tried to be nice on this podcast. I tried to give artists the benefit of the doubt a lot, but, and of course I love David Bowie, so this is coming from kind of a mixed place, but the guy, his debut album is just awful. It's just terrible. I mean, I was in awe when I listened to it. It was so bad.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with anything you said. I've listened to this thing like a little over 2.5 times, and it's awful.
It's
like
rough.
Every second that this album is on, I am resisting the urge to just slam my finger into my mouse and to turn the album off. There's quite a few songs on here that I just think are terrible. Track 2, "Sell Me a Coat," it could not be more British.
Yeah, that's
true. It really couldn't. And the lyrics, I think the thing that really gets me about this album is it's very clear that David Bowie does not know his musical identity yet.
Right.
And so he's trying all of these different tropes that were popular in generic British pop music in the late 60s and even really in the early 60s. And that's the thing I think that really makes this album tank, is that David Bowie really isn't trying to do anything new here. He's just putting out the most vanilla British pop album that he could for 1967, and the result is that you have a lot of very trite lyrics, very songs that aren't very sprawling or well written. They're just very, very simple little British ditties, and there's really nothing wrong with that, but there's also nothing inherently good. And when you listen to it, I just found that several of the tracks were very off-putting, and the whole listening experience wasn't really worth coming back to it and continuing to listen to it. So
no, it is difficult to listen to, and I completely agree with everything you say, Jake. And I listened to this several more times, and I started to see something through the haze of just irritation that I experienced when I listened to it. And
it's kind of like hives.
Right. And nothing redeeming, but I felt like I understood it better. So
sure.
After first listen, I would have taken everything you just said and said, case closed, let's move on. But I think in the context of what we'll see Bowie do going from here, there are a few things worth pointing out about his debut that actually merit discussion. So one of the things that I think is worth talking about here is something that we talk about a lot, Jake, that I don't always feel like people necessarily click with and understand. And this is a perfect use case example for this, is how we separate the various aspects of music. Because I think David Bowie's debut is just terrible, but why? Like, I think it begs that question. We have to examine why. And when I listen to it, there's actually some good stuff going on. To me,
it's not the worst thing that ever came out.
Right. What's odd is the worst part of it is David Bowie's vocals.
Yes,
his vocal
exactly
performance
right.
and presentation, and his lyrics. I'm not really a harpy for lyrics. Like, it doesn't really make or break an experience for me. But this is an example where lyrics really can be a detriment to an album, because when you listen to the instrumentals, like, yeah, there's a lot of just kind of like twee pop British psychedelia going on here, right? You know, there's some acoustic guitar, there's some horns and flutes, and just some kind of fun, whimsical stuff. And it's actually produced pretty decently, and it's written musically not terribly. Like, the chord changes, some of the chord changes we see are actually indicative of some of the brilliant chord progressions that David Bowie would write in later work. But what kills it is he starts singing and his voice is just nasally and irritating. It sounds immature, and then his lyrics are just atrocious. The biggest offenders for me, Jake, you mentioned "Sell Me a Coat."
Sell me a coat with little patch pockets. Sell me a coat 'cause I feel cold.
Which I think is one of the worst songs on here. The other two I'll call out are "Love You Till Tuesday" and "There Is a Happy Place."
Ah, beautiful baby, my burning desire started on Sunday. Give me your heart and I'll love you till Tuesday.
I mean, the lyrics, they made me flat out laugh. They're ridiculous. And I think if you remove those aspects of the songs, there's actually some decent stuff going on in other parts of the writing, but those things are so bad and they're put so much in the forefront that they just overshadow any trace amount of positive qualities that this album has. The other thing that I would say from there is it's worth looking into not only the chord progressions as a kind of a foreshadowing of things to come, but also some of the lyrical themes. You know, for being somewhat kind of whimsical, as I mentioned, there's also some darkness on this album, like in the song "We Are Hungry Men," where he takes kind of a Jonathan Swift satirical turn into like eating people, right? Like and killing babies. Like that's a pretty dark lyric for 1967 on an album like this. But these are the kinds of topics that are in David Bowie's head that we would start to see more and more. We also see some of his kind of gender bending and gender identity going against the norm there on like She's Got Medals, right? Mm-hmm. So there's little trace amounts of that we'll see later, but not any manifestation of them that really creates a good listening experience.
Right. This is a keen opportunity to do our comparison to Radiohead that we're obligated to do in every podcast. Because Pablo Honey, not the best album, first Radiohead album, but showed signs of greatness in there, showed what they were capable of, that kind of inkled towards the fact that they would be able to do these great things, these very expansive approaches to songwriting, and it kind of resonates with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think a lot of artists they need to get through an album before they find their real creative footing, right?
Yeah, it's about finding your identity.
Yeah, and you're right on when you said that David Bowie had not found his identity here. Now, he was almost like trying too hard. He was trying to assert an identity, and then I think his next album is where he started to actually experiment enough so that he could actually find his album. So I actually feel like a more proper first album is Space Oddity. Yeah. So let's move on to that one. 2 years later.
Okay.
I didn't have anything more to say about his debut. I don't know if you did. I'd rather push it from my mind. I'm done with it.
Yeah, I've forgotten about it.
All right.
Already. I'll never listen to it again in my life.
You probably not. So 2 years later in 1969, which is I think the biggest gap between albums we're going to see in this set, because he just continued to churn them out. He puts out Space Oddity, and Space Oddity is definitely where you start to find Bowie becoming more comfortable with his writing. You also start to see some more of his rock influences. I hear some Bob Dylan, Rolling Stones, the Beatles on this album, which we'll continue to hear throughout some of his other records as well. But after his debut album was not much of a success, he was actually dropped from his label and started trying to find success or attention from other labels. He had the single Space Oddity, which actually that song, the kind of quote-unquote title track from the album, is really what, in a way, kind of saved his career.
For sure.
He started having some success with that, and then was able to make the full rest of the LP, which is just, it's a world of difference from his debut. And this is an album, Jake, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on. We haven't talked about this one much, but as I continued to listen to it, I liked it a lot. I found myself really enjoying it, like more than just, like I'd listened to it in the background, like in years past, and just kind of been like, yeah, this is all right. But I actually think there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here.
There is a lot of cool stuff going on here, and I think the most notable thing, leading off with Space Oddity, the song that got him a little bit of attention. And by the way, his record label dropping him after his debut, I mean, I can't really blame his record label. That album sucked.
As a business decision, like based on that album alone, he shouldn't have even had a music career.
He's not going anywhere. But then, releasing Space Oddity, which is a much more progressive song where you have these kind of slow meandering parts that get kind of melodic at times and austere, and then they shift into like a more rocking, acoustic guitar driven chorus, and it just the oscillation between different intensities shows that he has a lot of talent for songwriting and being able to write from different perspectives. So that is a great song to kind of launch his career. And what better way to start like a long slew of space age comparisons than with a song called Space Oddity.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade.
That song also is 5 minutes, 19 seconds long. There's several songs on the 9 tracks and 46 minutes of David Bowie's Space Oddity that are very long. I think like a little over half the songs go above like 5 or 6 minutes, and it's in those tracks that you hear Bowie really experimenting, really trying out new ideas, and trying to push the boundaries of who he is as a person, as a musician, and as a songwriter. And I think that those are some of the best highlights on the album. Now, the downside with that is that there's also parts of every one of those songs that it kind of drones on a bit. It's a little too self-indulgent, and it also makes the shorter songs, which are a little bit more like 3 minutes or less, it makes those songs less impactful. You get track 3, that one of the first short songs, letter to Hermione, referring to a love that didn't go the right way, and Bowie kind of pining for one of his previous relationships. So you start to see that he's willing to embrace different song types, different song subjects, and really use lyrics as a personal healing, a personal growth, and a songwriting device all at the same time.
And when he's strong for you. And when you kiss, it's something new. But did you ever call my name just by mistake?
I like the way that he weaves in songs like Letter to Hermione and God Knows I'm Good, kind of more just acoustic, stripped down types of tracks. I think that track 2, Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, is a cool track. That one sounds a lot like Highway 61 or Blonde on Blonde era Bob Dylan, in the fact that it's kind of an upbeat rocker of a folk track. Where this album is also interesting as a transitional point from Bowie's really like infant music stages into his more mature records that we're going to get to, is you see him kind of starting to play around with characterization. You have the Major Tom character in Space Oddity, and in some ways that was kind of a figurative reflection of himself. But then you also have some very soul-bearing personal songs, like you mentioned, Jake, Letter to Hermione, Signet Committee, track 4, which is 9.5 minutes long, the second longest track in Bowie's entire catalog.
It's my second favorite song on the album.
It's a great song, and he justifies the 9.5 minutes. You also have this cool kind of like descending chromatic movement in the chorus that to me is a little bit reminiscent of Led Zeppelin's Dazed and Confused, or even like Beatles' Dear Prudence. So I think we're seeing some of those influences come in, which actually, come to think of it, the Led Zeppelin album came out the same year as this, so I don't know if we can really call that an influence, but it still reminds me of some stuff like that.
Bless you madly, sadly as I tie my shoes, I love you badly.
But I like that Signet Committee also, you start to see the lyrics have a little bit more meaning. But they're kind of personal, but also still kind of projecting. That song is all about Bowie's disillusionment with the whole hippie movement and how he felt it was ineffective and misguided, but it's kind of told through this storytelling device of this kind of like savior that comes along, but it's kind of a false idol. these are themes that he will explore more potently on later albums. So I think it's important to identify them here. But more importantly, from his debut, I mean, just the fact that he's able to effectively tell a story at all, because that's what he was trying to do on his debut, and he just flat out failed. He really did.
Failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing on Space Oddity that I think you hear is you start to hear production play a much bigger role in the album, in the sound of the album. You're hearing a lot more experimentation when it comes to synthesizers and other effects is part of the song and the song structure, which is actually a really interesting device. And, it's not really that new. Other artists were already playing with that, The Who, the Beatles. We're all experimenting at this point in time, and it was starting to get kind of druggy and crazy in 1969, to say the least. But it's just cool because that is such a quintessential part of David Bowie's music. So to hear it come out so early on, I think is a turning point for him as a songwriter.
Definitely. I also want to call out the closing track on this album, "Memory of a Free Festival," which I love the big build at the end with the group layered vocals. It's very anthemic, sounds really big, and I just think the writing and performance is really good there. I mean, this album, it's a little all over the place, but I find that I enjoy every track on it. It's a really cool step in his discography. Another thing I want to mention about it that I think we should do our best to call out on every album is this is where you start to see some key players come into the picture that would play a huge role in a lot of the rest of Bowie's career. And the people that David Bowie chose to surround himself with played a pivotal role in his development as an artist. On this album in particular, you have Tony Visconti coming into the picture, who helped produce it along with Gus Dudgeon. Gus Dudgeon would go on to work with Elton John more famously, but Tony Visconti would stay with him for quite a while. On this album, he played some bass guitar as well as like some flute, so a lot of different instrumentation coming in here. But then also on the single version of Wild-Eyed Boy from Free Cloud, he's uncredited, but is the introduction of guitarist Mick Ronson, who Bowie would go on to work with for the next several years and play a more prominent role in his music. So we go from Space Oddity, which was released in late 1969, to The Man Who Sold the World, which was released almost exactly a year later in November of 1970. This is where we start to see things come together as more of a band. Obviously, David Bowie's first album was just kind of him writing the songs and singing on top of this choreographed instrumentation. On Space Oddity, I felt like things started to come together into a bit more of a band, but David Bowie was still more of the focus, but it was so much more rock that you had to feel like there was more of a group performance aspect to it. Well, you really feel that here. And on Man Who Sold the World, we have Tony Visconti playing bass guitar, but also taking lead on production. We have Mick Woodmansey, who actually was better known as Woody Woodmansey, because there's so many
an awesome name.
Woody Woodmansey? I know, man.
Yeah.
Well, it's because his first name was Mick, and they had Mick Ronson on guitar, who they referred to as Ronno. There were just too many Micks floating around. There's also Mick Rock, the photographer who worked with Bowie. So there's just too many Mick. I don't think I know like anyone named Mick.
Woody Woodmansey, I just get this picture of Al Borland in my head. Like, only wears flannel, has cologne that smells like wood chips.
Sleeps in a tree. That's something like that. So we do have much more of a traditional rock band setup here, though, and I think that really helped to shape the way that Bowie wrote, because Bowie was such a chameleon. He could do anything, and I think he was more just about fitting into what he had available to him and his surroundings. I think he would push those limits a little bit, but when you've got Tony Visconti on bass and production, when you've got Mick Ronson, who is an amazing guitar player at your disposal, and then you have a more rock-oriented drummer, then you're going to have a more rock-oriented sound. And that's where this really starts to pick up. But I feel like he came out of the gate with this being more kind of a heavy, hard-hitting rock album rather than some of the more folk stuff he was doing before. I I feel like he really came out of the gate with a blast, because this album for 1970, it's heavy, man. It feels more
heavy.
like you're listening to a Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin album of the time.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a heavier rock album, and I think that was kind of true to, you know, as you pointed out, the tools that David Bowie had around him at the time with the other members of his band. In addition, just the music that he was in. This thing was clearly written to be a rock album that kind of went along with the music of 1970. The other thing that I noticed initially is that this thing just woofs at you.
Yeah.
The bass here that Tony Visconti. So he also produced in addition to playing bass.
Yeah. Oh, what do you know? It's like
what do you know?
It's like the opposite of And Justice for All.
It is. It's like he just turned himself up a little bit, because all I hear when I listen to The Man Who Sold the World is just nothing but woofing bass.
And that is a huge part, the production, but it's also like the guy played some killer bass lines. Like he was no slouch on the bass. He's not just going along with the notes. He's moving around. He's making the song move.
And more so than any other David Bowie album, I think that the instrumentation played the biggest role of the sound on The Man Who Sold the World. I don't think that there's any other album where I could say that you have a whole band operating like a band, where every single member has a well-written instrumental part that contributes to the whole of the sound in such a way that really what leads me to like one of my favorite qualities of The Man Who Sold the World, which is this is an album experience. It's the first album experience. His previous two albums were not written to be an album straight through listening experience, where this really was. He crafted it to be an album that flowed very well, and because of that, it does. And I found myself just kind of getting lost in it. I'd put it on, really enjoy it, really find a lot of the bass grooves, which were very prominent in the mix, very easy to follow along with, and in addition, the guitar work was really well. If anything, I think that the thing that is kind of disappointing about this album, and what separates it from every other Bowie album, at least in this set through 1975, is that Bowie's vocals play a lesser role on this album.
Yeah.
You don't hear his voice quite as prominently in the mix. His lyrics are there, but everything is so much more subtle in the vocals. This is a more subtle album focused on songwriting and instrumentation.
It is. I think part of that, too, is I don't think they did as much as they could have with vocal layers. I think there's there's kind of a cool call and response aspect to track 4, After All, which is kind of a spooky lower key song. But for the other tracks, I mean, on his upcoming albums, you'd hear a lot of layers of David's vocals, and you don't hear that as much here. So especially when the instrumentation is so thick, David's voice has a little bit of trouble cutting through at times. I think it's more successful on some of the more upbeat tracks, like Black Country Rock. I think works to have that solo vocal track like front and center. That song rules. I love the riff.
I love that song too.
You never know, you might find it here. Black Country Rock. Some say the view is crazy, but you made a dog.
Later on the album, you have two songs I want to call out are Savior Machine and She Shook Me Cold, are really like heavy, thick blues songs. I mean, if those came out today on a Ty Segall or like OC's album, they would sound believable as like fuzzy garage rock. But David Bowie was making it work in 1970, and I think that's pretty cool.
Oh Lord, she said, my God,
the title track, track 8, The Man Who Sold the World, I mean, you can really hear the Nirvana influence in that track.
So odd that he did a Nirvana cover.
Yeah, really strange.
We passed up on the step. We spoke of was and when. Although I
Where that song, it's actually kind of funny. I feel like that song, as the title track, almost fits in with the album the least. But I like that he named the album after that because it makes it feel more in place. It's more of a ballad. It has kind of a Latin feel to it with the weiro and some of the instrumental layers that are going on, the rhythms in general, the guitar work. But it's a really well-written song.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to point out here is the lyrics. I mentioned the lyrics on his debut. I didn't talk too much about the lyrics on Space Oddity. I mentioned that he was getting a little more personal in some ways, but then creating personas in other places. The Man Who Sold the World is a bit of an oddity in terms of lyrics.
Space Oddity?
Yes. In the lyrics in terms of David Bowie's catalog. But it works with the album, in that this is hard rock lyrics. You've got stuff about the devil. You've got stuff about being insane and all the madmen. You've got Running Gun Blues, which is kind of a violent escapade. And then you have the Supermen, which is kind of this like H.P. Lovecraftian kind of like otherworldly story. And he's starting to take some of those lyrical influences, those more fantastical and metaphysical themes, and working them into his songs, which works better for this kind of music. It's interesting that as even he gets kind of like songy, kind of singer-songwriter, he still slips those things in, but I think it really works for the hard rock format of The Man Who Sold the World.
So following the crazy hard rock direction of 1970s The Man Who Sold the World, David Bowie completely shifts gears and a year later puts out his fourth record, Hunky-Dory. Now, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is your favorite David Bowie album.
It is my favorite David Bowie album.
Why is it your favorite David Bowie album?
So this one is the one that it just clicks with me the most, and it's kind of interesting as to why. It's taken a lot of soul-searching and analysis to figure out why this is my favorite David Bowie album. And who knows if that'll ever change, but I don't see it changing. It hasn't through this experience. Because, David Bowie's albums are all so good. I take that back. There's his debut, and that one's pretty good. He's got so many good albums, and they're all so different that it's very hard to compare. But I find myself connecting to this one the most, and I don't want to get too much ahead of ourselves, but I can't really say why without referencing a little bit the next few albums that he would go on to do. So I think what I really connect to on Hunky-Dory is this is the most singer-songwriter album that David Bowie has, I feel like.
Yes,
there is a band, and the band is tremendous. And in fact, it's more of a solidified version of the Spiders from Mars that would be playing on the next few David Bowie albums. You still have Mick Ronson. Now you have the introduction of Trevor Bolder on bass. Tony Visconti is not involved in this one. And Ken Scott, who was previously the engineer, took production lead on this one. You still had Woody Woodmansey. And then you have Rick Wakeman from Yes come in on the piano, which is why the piano hauls ass throughout this whole album. So
that's a really good point.
Really, you can listen to the instrumentals on this album, and they are solid. They are. They're great throughout, but I feel like David Bowie's vocal melodies and performance is always at the forefront. And where on The Man Who Sold the World, we talked about his vocals sometimes having trouble cutting through because of how rich and dense the instrumentation is. Well, this isn't to talk down the instrumentation on Hunky-Dory. I just think he was so much more tactful in the way he arranged it and the way it was produced, because all of those elements, as beautiful as they are just there to lay the foundation for and support the vocals. These songs were written and arranged for David Bowie's vocals. They do a lot more layering, and I just find myself connecting to it because this is also, to me, the one moment in David Bowie's discography through pretty much the entirety of his first 15 years as a recording artist, at least, where I feel like you get David Bowie in his most pure form. Yep. There's no persona here. There's no Major Tom. There's no Ziggy Stardust. There's no Halloween Jack or Aladdin Sane. It's just pure Bowie. But this is the cross-section of that personal identity with just strong songwriting chops. So I think it's interesting because when we'll move on to Ziggy Stardust, we'll see that a lot of people connected to him and his fake persona. And now I think his personas that he created were really brilliant because they were close enough to himself to be cathartic, but different enough from himself to be some kind of form of escapism for him. But he didn't have any of that here. This is just bare bones David Bowie. Writing, songs like Kooks, which is about him dealing with being a new father, right? And him dedicating a song to Bob Dylan and a song to Andy Warhol. Like, he's just pouring out his heart about his influences. He's still...
It's Warhol, actually.
Oh, yeah. Warhol, as in holes.
As in hole.
I love that. I love that they have that in there. He does talk about some more kind of Lovecraftian kind of fantastical things on like Oh You Pretty Things and Quicksand. He deals with some kind of metaphysical stuff. But it's all still coming from a very personal place. This album, to me, in sound, I listen to it in the same way that I listen to the Beatles' White Album. Now, in a lot of ways, they're not that much alike, but I would say that with just the focus on pure songwriting and having strong like piano and guitar to back up and form the foundation of those songs. And also, I mentioned this to me is like the highlight of David Bowie as a person, as a singer-songwriter, not as a band and not as a persona, but him putting himself out there. Kind of how I felt about the Beatles' White Album. I mean, they were a band, but that album doesn't sound as much like a band album. It sounds like 4 highly functioning individual collaborators, which is kind of what the Beatles were at that point. But just the way he fits all this variety onto this album without it sounding contrived, with it all sounding very honest, and somehow working together. I can't help but connect with this. Where I think that people connected a lot with his various personas he would go on to, and I think that's really great. I think that's how he was able to reach out to kind of the underground counterculture and connect with a lot of people who were having identity crises of their own in the early 70s. That's just not really me. I like my musicians to be more honest and more soul-bearing, and I think that's really what he's doing here, and that's why I find myself connecting with this one the most. I just did a lot of talking. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was going to say there's nothing that I can say that is going to come close to describing this album better than you just did, because what I think I just witnessed was some of the best spoken music critique I've ever heard in my life. So kudos to you, my partner in crime, Tom Hummer.
Well,
so
thanks.
I'm just going to talk about my favorite songs like a chump.
Do it.
So I think like one of the coolest things about this album and one of David Bowie's most favorite songs, this is most famous songs, is his opening track on Hunky-Dory, which is Changes.
Fast to take that test. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man.
And he's almost like calling, he's like a baseball player calling that he's going to hit it to a home run before the pitch is thrown.
Yeah.
He's saying, like, I'm changing the direction of where I'm going. I'm not just a traditional rock and roll artist. And he really executes it quite well. That song is addictive. It really highlights the entire tone of the record. Tom, you pointed out early on that there is just an immense, wonderful use of piano throughout this record. This record feels like a singer-songwriter album in that it's very piano and acoustic guitar driven, but it's all about the songwriting. And on every single track on this album, you really feel like how David Bowie's soul is coming out through the construction of the song itself. And if you actually try to break down each and individual track and see how he constructed it, you can see that it's much more complex than many of his previous songs on any of his previous 3 records. So you saw that maturation process happen with the rock direction of The Man Who Sold the World, and now you're seeing it go to the next level on a more singer-songwriter Hunky-Dory. The album moves on. Track 2, Oh You Pretty Things, very, very kind of grand poppy song. And then you have other tracks on here like Life on Mars, which is an instant classic.
Oh, yeah.
Kooks, as Tom pointed out earlier. The second half of this album, what I used to criticize this album for, it was very front heavy, but I found the more that I listened to it, one, that Tom's right and everything that he just said is totally true. The more you listen to it, it's very obvious. But also that the second half of the album, David Bowie is paying homage to Andy Warhol song for Bob Dylan. Queen Bitch is kind of a reference to the Velvet Underground. So you're really seeing a lot of
Lou Reed-esque, that song.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of David's influences coming out in his music very explicitly in the lyrics and song titles and in the actual style of the song that he wrote it in. What's crazy about it is he pulls it off. It's fantastic. And we were joking about the beginning of Andy Warhol earlier. But that song is fantastic. That guitar melody, the acoustic do 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 that gets stuck in my head.
Metallica would go on to rip off.
I was gonna say like that sounds like something Metallica would do, and that's the level of melody that's in this, and see our Metallica deep dive for Metallica and melody. But all of these songs just have brilliant melodies throughout, and that comes from exceptional craft of songwriting. We could probably talk about this album all night long. This is a masterpiece and deserves all the accolades it's received over the years. It's commonly included in many top 100 albums of all time lists, and deservedly so.
Yeah. We also see here Mick Ronson start to play a larger role beyond just being a guitarist, as he did the string arrangements. I mean, the string arrangements and that whole scoring is what helps make Life on Mars such an epic classic track.
She could spit in the eyes of fools if they ask her to focus on sailors fighting in the dance hall. Oh man!
I also love that, like, this is the only Bowie album where you have a place for a song like 8-Line Poem. You know, just a really simple kind of in-between track that helps move things along. I love that about it. I mean, you're right, Jake. We could go on and on forever, but I think that we've kind of made our main point. You know, Hunky-Dory was certainly a turning point for David Bowie, but still he would go on to do things completely differently. All right, so we just talked about Hunky-Dory, which came out in December of 1971, right at the end of the year. And now we're going on to the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, David Bowie's fifth album, monumental album, once again produced by Ken Scott. And this came out in June 1972, a mere 6 months after Hunky-Dory came out. Now, how you write these songs and pump them out as quickly as they did here is absolutely beyond me. But the people on this album, this is once again just coming down to that tight-knit rock group. You have David Bowie, Mick Ronson, Trevor Bolder, and Woody Woodmansey, who are the core of the rock band David Bowie, well, Ziggy Stardust, rather, and the Spiders from Mars. This is where we start to see David Bowie embracing alternate personas and creating a real storyline with his songs. I mean, this album's another masterpiece. Jake, I know this is your favorite David Bowie album, right?
It is my favorite David Bowie album, and I tried to disprove it in preparation for this, because several of these albums that we're covering tonight in this part one of David Bowie's discography, I think, are worthy of being anyone's favorite David Bowie record. And this one was the one that I, back when I was in college, I really fell in love with this record and played it all the time, and had listened to his other records kind of sparingly here and there, but this is the one I kept coming back to. It's the one that really connected with me. So it was going to be hard to dismantle this from being my favorite favorite David Bowie album of all time, and I really tried. I genuinely tried. I listened to all the other records first and multiple times before trying this one out, and I gotta say, like, I put this one on and I fell in love with it all over again. Yeah. Because the thing about the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars isn't this insane concept, which is super cool that he had this concept and everything's connected through the lyrics and all the lyrical themes that he shows and the crazy persona that he puts into this album. It isn't any of all of the hullabaloo about this album that makes it special. What makes this album special is that it's going to be very difficult for you to find an album that came out in this time frame where every single track accomplishes so much and holds its own. Yeah. Every single song on this album is a masterpiece. Mm-hmm. And every time I listen to it, I'm blown away by every track. This is one of those albums, and Tom, we've over the years that we've done Velocities in Music, we've heard a few of these albums, and it's always really hard to pick tracks. Like, what are your favorite songs from the Rise and Fall?
Possibly say.
And a lot of people go to Ziggy Stardust, and that was the song. That song was my first exposure to David Bowie back in 2005, playing it on Guitar Hero, the first Guitar Hero game. And then I listened to this record and fell in love with every other track. Ziggy Stardust is my least favorite track on this album.
I actually agree. It's not a highlight for me. It's my least favorite as well. Yeah.
No. It's cool. It's obviously a cool guitar lick, but that's really the most simple song on the album. But the opening track, 5 Years, every time I listen to it, I get goosebumps.
Same,
and like for songs that can do that, like I always give them a lot of props and try to figure out why. And the reason why 5 Years gives me goosebumps is because, man, does David Bowie just belt it out. And the whole thing is just one huge dynamic build and finally ends in this like guitar freak out at the very end. And I think it's just the most awesome songwriting device I've seriously ever heard. And it was 1972.
Yeah, 5 Years is my favorite David Bowie song in this set from his first 9 albums that we're talking through.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
probably my maybe my second or third favorite Bowie song, period.
I think I'll go there with you. Like it accomplishes that much. Like I really love it. I think that for me it's a battle between 5 Years and Starman. So Starman track 4 is one of David Bowie's just best songs, period. It's one of the best songs of all time. And I can't think of another song that could better sum up the life of David Bowie outside of Starman.
That's true. Where I think that 5 Years really succeeds as well as the album opener is while it sets up what is known as one of the most successful and popular kind of pop rock albums of all time. It's not a pop structure. It's not verse and chorus. It's just a continual build with a very emotional story. And man, when it gets to that climax with that, I kiss you, you're beautiful, I want you to walk, we got 5 years. Like, I just lose it.
So I felt like an actor, and I thought of more, and I wanted to get back there. Your face, your race, the way that you talk. I kiss you, you're beautiful, I want you to walk. We got 5 years.
You should see me sing along to that in my car. I have it turned up all the way, and I'm like damn near in tears every single time I listen to that.
And you're screaming the lyrics.
Yeah,
as
you
can't,
to.
Yes, you have to. And I... Yep.
It's so good.
I'm going to listen to this on the way to work tomorrow. Like, I know I'm going to listen to this because I'm so excited about this. This is one of those records that, like, once you play it, you can't help but go over it in your head again and again and again. Mm-hmm. And the thing is it doesn't take very many listens to really get the songs. And I think that's how you know an album has transcended to kind of like a legendary status is when the songs are just so damn good on it that just after hearing it a couple times, you can remember them. You can hear the hooks in your head. You can hear and understand the monumental songwriting that created it. And I think that's something that is truly unique about this record apart from all the other David Bowie albums. And I actually agree with you, Tom, after talking with you about Hunky-Dory. I do think that album comes close. For me, this is his magnum opus. Yeah, other songs on this record that like I really like. I like track 2, Soul Love, Moon Age Daydream, Starman. Like those first 4 tracks I think are just fantastic.
There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds.
Suffragette City and then Rock and Roll Suicide are great ways of ending the album too. I do think that the back half is a little weaker than the front, but that is the most minor criticism I could possibly throw at this near perfect record.
Yeah, I agree. Where I think too this is interesting in direction and in context of the time is this is the album that started getting David Bowie a lot like major attention. I mean, Hunky-Dory... Right.
This is his breakthrough record.
Yeah, he said, Hunky-Dory was big in that it started getting people to take him seriously as a songwriter, but he hadn't really broken through yet. This is the one where people are like, okay, this guy's a big deal. And where you'd think that the persona and the stage act they had, where the whole band started wearing makeup, and him and Mick Ronson were doing kind of a Mick Jagger, Keith Richards dynamic on stage. Like, it's easy to get caught up in the image and think of it as a gimmick, but the fact is, no one would give a shit about those things if the music wasn't so damn good. He could have done the same things, and if the music was crap, people would have just laughed him off. But the music is what legitimized those image gimmicks and this whole theatrical stage thing. David Bowie thought of himself as an actor, and as I mentioned while we were talking about about Hunky-Dory, I think that the Ziggy Stardust thing and these characters he's coming up with is a cathartic way for him to be able to express himself and what he was feeling without actually putting himself in a vulnerable position of being himself. He was able to be someone else and still address some of the insecurities and the problems in his life and that were going on in his head. And this is the perfect manifestation of that. But also, I think that once again, he's just a master of using the people that were at his disposal. This album, notably, the biggest change between it and Hunky-Dory is the fact that it doesn't have Rick Wakeman all over it. And what do you know? It's a much less piano-focused album. I think that, this is only speculation, but I think it would make sense that what happened on Hunky-Dory is he realized he had this freaking awesome rock band that he was just using to support his more singer-songwriter type songs. And I feel like going into Ziggy Stardust, he thought, I have this rock band, let's write some freaking rock songs. And so you do have still a lot of extra instrumentation on here. You have the notable saxophone on Soul Love, which I love that. You do have some pianos, but they're more as just a backing layer to support the chord structure. It's not really the focus a whole lot, and there's not a lot of movement in that. But David Bowie, I mentioned at the beginning that saxophone was one of his first instruments. He finds really great ways to work it into the songs here. But for having a gimmicky image, which I don't even say in a negative context here because, as I mentioned, that's not really the focus. But for having that kind of image, this actually is one of the more simple and straightforward works of his musically, in that he just focused on writing great rock songs. He didn't try to do too much with it stylistically. He didn't try to stray all over the place like he really kind of had done on his last few albums. It's much more focused, but he still finds opportunities for fitting in those extra instrumental layers. And I think that's another thing that just makes this genius. All right, so moving on from Ziggy Stardust and Spiders from Mars.
Seriously, it was a year later. He's gotten famous, so he, rising in popularity, releases Ziggy Stardust, gets massively famous.
And actually, a couple opportunities come from that. I want to take a slight detour and mention he works with Mott the Hoople on All the Young Dudes, producing that album, producing Iggy Pop and the Stooges' Raw Power, producing Lou Reed's Transformer, along with Mick Ronson, who Mick Ronson shines with some more of his great arrangements on Transformer. So they're also getting this experience of working with other artists.
Yeah, all of a sudden, David Bowie and his band are becoming the fabric of modern rock music in the early 1970s, which is super, super cool and just kind of goes to show how big of a legend this dude is. And then a year later, he, after getting really famous, breaking through, and then going on an extensive tour, releases Aladdin Sane, which is kind of a play on words of a lad insane, kind of showing how the persona of Ziggy Stardust was evolving into this kind of new character. And what I think is most interesting is that Aladdin Sane, which, Tom, is an album, you and I have talked extensively about this one just as we were preparing for this, because it's an album that I have really liked from the moment that I listened to it. This was one of the few albums in this set that I wasn't familiar with before preparing. I'd listened to it maybe one time, one year in years past, and then now really dove into it. And I really enjoyed this record. But Tom, I know that this is one that was a little bit harder to connect with you, and I think that one of the reasons why I find it so engaging is because of how much I love Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, and this is really just kind of the next step after that. It's kind of an evolution. It reminds me a lot of Blur as they transition from Park Life to The Great Escape.
That's a really good comparison, I'd say, because it has the closest of any two back-to-back albums of David Bowie's, especially in the set we're talking about. These two have the most in common. It's the most logical step.
Yep, it's a similar sound, but it's more expansive, and it's much more critical and biting. And I think that this is what happens when British artists release a big album and then tour in America, is that America just sours them on life because America sucks the soul out of everything.
That is true.
And the alternate fake title of this record is Ziggy Goes to America, right? And the whole idea is that, and you can see this on the album cover, is that this album kind of has split personalities, which is indicative of the lightning strike coming down David Bowie's face on the album cover. And, you know, you have some of these songs that are in a much more kind of Ziggy Stardust format, and other songs in this record, about half the songs in this record are a little bit different, a little bit more piano infused. And you hear a lot of like jam outs at the end of these records, the instrumentals. Like, he really let the instrumentals just go out of control at times on this record, and that's something that I really like, because it actually, I think, kind of wrote the book for how you can use chaos as an instrument in popular music. And that's something that I think is hugely influential and really cool to hear, especially in like the title track or in the famous track Time off this record.
Mike Garson, the piano player on Aladdin Sane, I think is a highlight. And he has more of a jazz background, and you hear that style come into the sound here. And that solo on Aladdin Sane, I mean, God, it's just this is avant-garde, free jazz solo in the middle of a rock song, but it works so well. I think it's really brilliant that he works in these kind of like odd little things like that really spice up this album that would otherwise be, once again, kind of a straightforward rock album. He's really mixing things up. So I think that's a neat addition. Other than that, a lot of the main band, you know, here's staying really the same. So how is it different? To me, the reason I struggled a little bit more with this album is because it does sound a lot like Ziggy Stardust in a lot of the core fundamental ways, but I feel like it's lacking a lot of the emotional resonance and memorable like catchiness of Ziggy Stardust. I kind of started to get past that because it does have some really great highlights on here, but I think that the whole Ziggy Goes to America thing is a really apt way to describe this, and it makes sense that David Bowie would kind of summarize it that way, because it does have this like 1950s and 60s American rock and roll retro kind of feel. Honestly, the imagery I get from this is almost like the musical Grease. Now follow me here, Jake, because this is kind of a weird comparison. But I like many of these songs, I feel like would work in a musical. If you picture like a 1950s American diner where you have girls with ponytails and skirts and guys with leather jackets that are up on the diner countertops dancing, and David Bowie's in front like some kind of like extraterrestrial Danny Zuko, like leading the whole thing. Everything it has that feel.
Everything about this album musically, both the vocals and instrumentation, the songwriting is flamboyant and vibrant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like you would expect in a musical. So I do think that that's a really good comparison.
And you have the doo-wop influences in here too on songs like Prettiest Star and like Drive-In Saturday. Mm-hmm. But where I still have to give him credit is you know, despite having that kind of retro sound, a lot of the comparisons I make to this come later. Like I mentioned, the musical Grease, which this predates by like 4 years. The song Cracked Actor, which is one of the heavier tracks, to me that sounds like a Queens of the Stone Age track. Like I listen to that and I just hear Josh Homme singing it. Forget that I'm 50 'cause you just got paid. Crack, baby, crack. Show me your real smack. You also have Drive-In Saturday, which to me sounds like kind of a pre-Elvis Costello, like new wave kind of song. But I think we got to get to, for me, the highlight of this album is track 6, Time.
Agreed.
I absolutely love that song. And once again, it's one that starts like with just this very sparse piano and David Bowie singing. And I just feel like a curtain had risen and like he's singing to an audience there. Like it is very
it almost
theatrical.
Has that cabaret feeling at the beginning, right? And I think that like Time is so good because it's one of Bowie's best, right? Like anyone is gonna listen to like a Bowie like best of greatest hits compilation is going to pick out Time as like one of the key Bowie songs of his early years. But I think that it's so good that it actually overshadows the rest of the album.
A little bit,
Because
yeah. Because it's such a
none of the-
monumental track. None of the others
is.
achieve that much.
Yeah, and where on like Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, like every song held its own. I mean, you had tracks like Starman that really kind of rose above the rest, but it wasn't so precipitous of a rise that you felt like the rest of the album paled in comparison. Time actually has that effect where that song is so singularly good that the rest of the album isn't rising to meet it or coming close to meeting it. So I think that the album feels a little disjointed. Time, where they split the two sides of the record. Time starts this B side of the record, and it does feel like two sides of a record when you're listening to this.
Yeah.
So what I like a lot of things about Aladdin Sane. I like a lot of the songwriting influence, the additional expressionism that you hear in the songwriting, the experimentation that you hear and letting the instrumentals jam out. Just like you see Bowie pushing ahead. This does not fundamentally. I think where I ended up with this, Tom, just so you're aware, is I actually came down on this the more I listened to it because it doesn't have that cohesive album experience. It feels contorted. It feels like it doesn't know its own identity at times, and like it's dealing with more than it can handle. It feels stressed, and because of that, a lot of that comes out in the music, and so part of that is beauty, and part of that is annoyance to me.
That makes sense, and I agree with that. I think that for me, the album suffers a little bit after the song Time. Those last four tracks, the Gene Genie is a highlight for me in that back
I like
half.
that song a lot, actually.
But Prettiest Star, especially after coming after Time, is kind of a forgettable track to me. Let's Spend the Night Together as a Rolling Stones cover. I think that David Bowie does a fine job of it. I mean, there was a cover on each of his last couple albums. Ziggy Stardust had It Ain't Easy, which was a cover, but it wasn't as notable. It wasn't such a defining song already. And it wasn't as obvious as a cover. I think that David made it work into the flow of the album a lot. And also the closing track, Lady Grinning Soul, just doesn't do quite as much for me. So I still really like this album. I love it when it's on. I still listen to it all the way through. But I'll admit, like, my eyes glaze over a little bit once I get past Time. But that's about the biggest complaint that I have. But Jake, you mentioned that this album, it struggles a little bit with identity, and you start to feel like David Bowie's getting just a little tired or misled with it. And I think that segues really nicely into where we're going next with his discography, because this album was released in April 1973, and in June 1973, at a concert over in Great Britain, David Bowie would announce that this would be the last show of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. He just said, this is not only our last show of the tour, this is our last show ever. And everyone went nuts because no one knew he was going to do that. In fact, most of his band didn't even know he was going to do that. I believe he told Mick Ronson about it, but didn't tell the others. And then they played Rock and Roll Suicide in the encore, and that was the end of the show. Which is odd because they still went on after that to record the cover album Pinups, which would come out just a few months later in October of 1973. And Pinups still carries kind of the Ziggy mentality. It still has that same band format. And even, he still has kind of the Ziggy look on the cover of the album, but it was an interesting move, I think, to kill off the Ziggy Stardust character just a couple years after it had happened and after he had so much success. And I understand why that would have been shocking, but in a way, I think it makes sense, and I think it was the right move. I think he maybe could have done it differently, but that's a different conversation. I believe in being respectful to your bandmates and not taking advantage of them or taking them for granted. And I think there was some of that, but not to get too much into the weeds on that. It's an interesting move because David Bowie is someone who needs to shed his skin regularly and reinvent himself. And think about what it would have been like if it was 1978 and David Bowie was still trying to capitalize on the whole Ziggy Stardust thing. I think it would have come off as contrived. It would have come out as a cash grab, and I think the music would have suffered for it. I think he needed to let it be what it was for those beautiful couple of albums and move on. So
I agree.
Then he goes on to make Pinups, which Pinups, we'll talk about, but probably not spend too much time on because it's a covers album. And I understand from an artistic standpoint why, as a musician, you have to clear your head, take a break from songwriting for a little bit, and maybe just kind of get back to your roots in a more stress-free way. But it is it's kind of a shame because you think about it and like the stuff that he was writing was way more exciting than anything on the Pinups album.
Totally agree. I actually find Pinups to be kind of forgettable. It's 12 songs, 34 minutes long. It really just, while it's fine to listen to, like when it's on, I enjoy listening to it. None of the tracks here make me go, oh, this is definitive Bowie. So I kind of, I've listened to this 3 times now, and I kind of just don't have a lot to say about it, just from the standpoint that it is what it is. It's very, very face value.
Yeah. Well, it has the rock band format. I feel like Bowie does some weird things with his vocals that kind of bastardize his own vocal identity. Like, he doesn't sound like himself a whole lot. Some of the highlights for me, I do like Here Comes the Night. I think that's a pretty good one. Works in some good saxophone in here from time to time still. I also like Shapes of Things pretty well. I think that's a cool song with some different movement to it. He does a couple of The Who covers. He does a cover of See Emily Play by Pink Floyd, which I kind of like, but then I don't like the whole like pitch shift vocal thing in the chorus. It sounds kind of off-putting. So this is one that like it's kind of neat. Like I'll probably still listen to it from time to time, but
I would buy it if I saw it in a record store,
which I did today.
Yeah, you did today, you jackass. God, I'm so
it was
jealous.
like $15, and it was an older pressing that I thought was pretty cool. So
two songs that I do really like on this one are Friday on My Mind, and then also the last track on the record, which is Where Have All the Good Times Gone. I think that's a really good cover.
Won't you tell me where have all the good times gone? Where have all the good times gone?
Yeah, Kinks cover, good point. And the Kinks were a good band that you can tell had a lot of influence on David Bowie. So yeah, I don't think there's too much more to say about Pinups other than, honestly, aside from the music, I think the most important thing about it was kind of the last thing that the Spiders from Mars as a quote-unquote band did together before David Bowie decided to branch off yet again and do something different.
All right, Tom.
All right.
Ziggy Stardust is no more.
Mm-hmm.
A year has passed, so it's obviously time for another David Bowie album.
Yep.
So
got no time to waste.
He has no time to waste. This guy is a workaholic, and in May of 1974, he releases his 8th studio record, Diamond Dogs. Now, Diamond Dogs was a record that I had not been familiar. I hadn't listened to this once prior to starting to prepare for this review. And actually, part of the reason why is because, when I dive into an artist with an extensive catalog, one of the things I do is I go and check review sites and see, which albums have the best reviews.
What are the notable ones?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I try to listen to, that's how I listened to Hunky-Dory for the first time, is that it had a 4.5, 5-star review on several different sites. I definitely went out and checked that one out. Diamond Dogs, on the other hand, did not. It gets a lot of mixed reviews. Some critics love it, some critics hate it. So I just never checked it out because it just hadn't been rated so too highly on the sites that I was looking at. So I listened to Diamond Dogs for the first time, and I finished the album, and I go, well, damn, that was different, and there's something going on here. Like, there's something more to this than just a typical Bowie record. So I listened to it again, and then when that time finished, I wanted to listen to it again, and I actually went like on a 3-day binge where I listened to nothing but Diamond Dogs. And what I found was that this record, more than any other Bowie record in this first set that we're doing, this first set of 9 records that we're doing, plays like an album listening experience more than any. He wrote it, he constructed this thing to be one musical concept, and it's really, really well executed. And the more that I dug into it, the more I got through all of the dense layers of sound, the more I fell in love with this record. This has become one of my favorite Bowie records of this first set, probably my second or third favorite, behind I think Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, and behind Hunky-Dory. This is probably my third favorite.
Oh, nice.
So So because of that, I find this to be a really rewarding listen, and I think that one of the reasons is because it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's 38 minutes, 11 tracks. It flows very nicely. Got a lot of shorter tracks in there. The title track, track 2 on the record, is the only really long track, coming in just a hair over 6 minutes. But the sound is so immense and difficult to penetrate. There's so many layers of music going on in every one of these tracks.
Yeah, and yet it's somehow kind of raw, which there are two like production aspects to note in that David Bowie took over, he wore the hat of producer and guitarist, which is something that he didn't really do on any of albums prior to this. He didn't have Mick Ronson in the band anymore, which honestly, in my opinion, like this album didn't necessarily suffer for it. It's still very good for what it is, but Mick Ronson was such a big part of what he was doing that it's kind of crazy he decided to try to do that on his own. But where the works kind of for Diamond Dogs is that the writing on this album is very much more like Rolling Stones, or I even would compare it to like Iggy Pop and the Stooges. It's kind of raw sounding. So so for the songwriting to work, it makes sense to have Bowie as a producer be a little less experienced with that part of it. For Bowie as a lead guitarist to be a little less experienced from that. It feels a little sloppy. It feels a little noisy, but it works with the songwriting, I would say. I also think it is neat that this feels so much more albumized. I mean, on side 1, you have 6 tracks, but really you only have like 3 songs. You have Future Legend starting the album off, which is more of an intro that goes right into Diamond Dogs. Those two feel like they go together. Then you have Sweet Thing Candidate and the Sweet Thing Reprise, which is really just one suite of songs. See what I did there? Anyway. And then you have side 1 closing with Rebel Rebel, which is one of the more recognizable just kind of Bowie rock songs. So it's interesting that while he split side 1 into all these different parts, it really just feels like only a few songs. And then you go to side 2 where you get some of the more Orwellian 1984 type influences. He actually wanted this to be a concept album about 1984, but couldn't quite get the rights to go along with it. So he does have the songs 1984 and Big Brother, which then lead into the closing track. So, for the 38 minutes on this album, you don't get as much of a songy experience as you did with his last few albums. It feels more like continuous movements. Also, I don't know about you, Jake. I feel like the song Rock and Roll With Me might be like the first power ballad.
When you rock and roll with me, no one else I'd rather be.
Could be.
It feels like an 80s power ballad when I put that on. That song,
Yeah, definitely.
That song also features Earl Slick, who's a guitarist that David Bowie would go on to work with in some future albums. So kind of similar to like how he just worked a little bit on Space Oddity with Mick Ronson. Like he was kind of, I don't know, maybe testing out another guitarist there. I'm sure that's probably not exactly how it went, but yeah, this is an album I like a lot too, Jake. I don't really understand the hate on it. I know it's a little raw, it's a little grinding. There's some production things that I don't quite agree with, like some of the vocal effects and the title track are kind of off-putting to me, but overall it's a great record.
Yeah, I think that it's just natural composition, and the songwriting is so much less accessible than the rest of Bowie's records. That it makes it harder to grasp on just a few listens. Like you really have to dig at this thing to get at its true essence and all of the individual little Lego bricks that compose all of the songs. You mentioned Rolling Stones influence, and like kind of the first thing that I heard when I was listening to this is, while it's a very Bowie sound and very densely constructed, you do hear Bowie's influences permeate through the mix, and Rolling Stones is the number one influence that I hear on this record. In fact, the lead track, Rebel Rebel, track 6 on this record, I thought was a Rolling Stones song for the longest time, and then
I don't blame you.
I mean, it really does sound like it could be the Rolling Stones. Now, all that said, I think that like Aladdin Sane, Rebel Rebel is similar to Time on Aladdin Sane. Rebel is too good for the rest of this album. I think where Diamond Dogs makes up for it is that the rest of the album holds itself together because all of the songs are dependent on one another to make the album listening experience. No one song really stands on its own besides Rebel. So Rebel kind of feels a little disjointed from the rest of the record, but the way that it just kicks in with that guitar riff coming out of Sweet Thing into Rebel is just so freaking awesome that every time I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. But it's like a breath of fresh air, where I've been just kind of like slowly treading water through mud up until that point.
So Jake, interesting thing about Diamond Dogs. So they say that diamonds are a girl's best friend and dogs are man's best friend. So shouldn't Diamond Dogs as an album be like everyone's best friend?
Yeah.
So also in 1974, David Bowie put out a live album. We're not really going to spend much time on the live albums. I don't think that's really a highlight of his, transitions or anything. But it is notable, at least enough, that he was doing that kind of work as well. So we move now into early 1975, and in March, David Bowie puts out his 9th album, Young Americans. Young Americans was recorded in America, in Philadelphia. David Bowie
by young people.
But I guess I can't argue with that. So we go from the raw kind of rock sound of Diamond Dogs, where we have this Halloween Jack character that David Bowie's created that really plays almost no part in the album at all. Like, there's kind of a story, but at that point, it's almost like, who cares? Like you don't listen to Diamond Dogs for the story. It's not really notable. But
it's post-persona at that point.
Right. Where David Bowie is going into this weird kind of like animalistic persona. Then all of a sudden, for Young Americans in 1975, he puts on a suit and goes to Philadelphia and tries to capture this Philadelphia soul, a kind of blue-eyed soul sound, which is a really odd turn for him to take. And now all of a sudden he's playing like television spots as this kind of like respectable like soul musician, which is just a strange turn for him to take. Young Americans, for me, I really, I do like the sound pretty well. Like he does it well. As most of the things David Bowie tries to do, he captures it well and he stays pretty true to it. He gets a lot of great backup vocalists. One of the more notable ones, aside from like some of the female ones like Ava Cherry and Robin Clark, Luther Vandross is on this album. Luther Vandross ended up becoming a big name. But he's working with the band on these compositions that are more of these flowing kind of soul movements. They're still, they sound a little poppy and a little more mainstream, but really in terms of how the songs move along, he lets them develop kind of slowly. This album for me, I liked it, and I liked it more and more as I listened to it, but I plateaued on it a bit, mostly because of the back half. Similar to what I said about Aladdin Sane, while I like one track on the back half, I feel like it gets a little more forgettable. But I like the title track of this album a lot. I like a lot of the saxophone work, the arrangements. I feel like the sound is just very rich, and David Bowie sells the vocal performance pretty well.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think this album's bookended really well. The opening track, the title track, is a highlight for me, and then the last track, "Fame," is one of David Bowie's hits that is obviously a very good song. In the middle of the album, I agree that there's some points where I think it lags a little bit, which holds it down from being one of my favorite Bowie albums in this set, of at least his first 9 records. That is. One thing I want to point out about this record is that this takes a notable difference in production, and Tony Visconti actually says that about 85% of Young Americans was recorded live. And when you listen to the music, that comes out a lot in the fact that you're just hearing a different kind of sound being played. Not just that, David Bowie's obviously going for a different style because he's David Bowie and he wants to change directions on every album. That's cool. We kind of expect that at this point. But in addition, to actually change the sound and actually change the production style and try new sounds out. In 1975, this was happening all over the place. A lot of notable acts, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, were all trying out different sounds, and it's like production equipment finally reached the point that artists with these budgets could start playing around with new sounds and do cool new things. All that led to a very thick mix, a very kind of contorted lens to view the music from. And that's twisted metaphor. But to me, I think Young Americans has an interesting sound because of that, so it makes it kind of notable. But the songwriting just isn't there to hold it up, in my opinion. With all the cool things that are going on in the production, the songwriting just isn't there. So to me, this one has a couple of great highlights, but outside of that, it's kind of forgettable.
I agree with that. I like the first 4 tracks pretty solidly. From there, like Somebody Up There Likes Me and Can You Hear Me are a little forgettable. But Jake, I want to know how you feel about the Beatles Across the Universe cover that's on.
Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna
Oh, God damn it. So I have this theory, and I might have said this when we did a deep dive on the Beatles a couple years back, Tom, but like no Beatles cover, I've never heard a Beatles cover that I actually thought was good.
Yeah. Just
Like,
kind of a sacred cow. Don't try to tackle it.
Don't do it. You can't, like, if you're going to do a cover, for it to be a good cover, you need to make it your own, and you need to do it exceptionally well. You're not going to be able to make a Beatles song your own. It's too well known for you to make it your own, and you're not going to be able to make it better than what the Beatles did. You're just not. You're just not.
I think it's particularly odd in this case that John Lennon is credited as doing backup vocals on this cover of Across the Universe. And John Lennon also co-wrote Fame, one of the highlight tracks from this album with David Bowie. Why did John let this happen? This was only like 5 years after Let It Be came out.
Yeah, he's clearly just slashing and burning his legacy. Like, that's what he was doing at this point.
I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a pretty bad cover, and it's
an awful cover. It's like they were trying to make. It's like when you like have a handful of poo, and you're like, "Well, what should I do with this handful of poo? Should I smear it all over the walls or wash it down the toilet?" I mean, of course, I'm gonna smear it all over the walls.
I find myself in that situation all the time.
I'm sure
handful
you do,
of
Tom
poo.
Hummer.
What do you do with it? It's the age old.
What is this, a 1980s gangster rap song?
I think there's an Aesop's fable about that. I mean, everyone goes through that. So, no, I think it is an unfortunate, just bad mark on this record. Just sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just not good. But I think that there are some really good things to say about this. I especially like in the song Right, when there's that vocal interplay back and forth between the backup vocalist and David Bowie. That's a really nimble, complicated piece of music right there. And I think that the way the instrumentals work with it is really smooth. So there's some good things about this. I think it's a good album, but certainly not a highlight of this first set for me.
Well, Tom, that takes us through 1975. 9 Bowie albums in between 1967 and 1975. That is an insane amount of content for one artist to produce in that amount of time and to reach such a legendary status in such a short time. Now, that's just part one. How many albums did Bowie release in his lifetime? 26?
Mm-hmm.
And we just did 9?
We just did 9.
So
we got the next 8 ahead of us.
Okay. So what does that take us to? Walk me through this.
It takes us from 1976, starting with Station to Station, going through the 80s.
Okay.
So that's what we'll be doing next. Yep.
Well, that's what I get to listen to for the next couple weeks. I'm very excited about that.
Here we go, man.
So, Tom, which were your favorite albums from the first 9?
Definitely Hunky-Dory and Ziggy Stardust.
Those two are your favorites?
Yeah, those are both A+ albums for me.
Okay, cool.
From there, you want me to just go through the rest of mine? Or do you want
just go through the rest.
So, his debut album, I previously was just thinking hard F. But I'm going to give it a D. I'm going to give it like a D- because I don't have the heart to give it an F because there are a couple of redeeming qualities, but it's just bad. I'm going to give Space Oddity like I actually think that's a good like B plus album. I like it quite a bit. For Man Who Sold the World, that's an A- for me. I really like that album. I'm gonna go ahead. I'm already said Hunky-Dory and Ziggy Stardust are both A+ for me. Aladdin Sane is a B+ for me. Diamond Dogs, I'm probably gonna give a B to B+, and then Young Americans, I think. Oh, I forgot Pinups. Pinups, I'm gonna give like a C, C-. And then Young Americans, I'll probably give a B-. That's just my rough. What about you?
All right. From the top, Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and Spiders from Mars, A+. Hunky-Dory, A. Then I'll probably go Diamond Dogs. I'll give that a like low A- to high B+. Then Aladdin Sane is a B+. From there, a little bit of a drop. I'll go Man Who Sold the World. I'll do like a mid B. Space Oddity, a B-. Young Americans, C+. Pinups, I'll go C-. And then David Bowie, self-titled, F+.
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 Oh, okay.
F+. You know what you get? F+.
Love it. This has been a great deep dive. I can't wait to get to the rest of his catalog and have some new David Bowie albums to put in my rotation, starting with Station to Station.
This next set, there's a few in here that I'm very familiar with and a few that I've literally never listened to before. So I'm really excited to go through. This has been a very rewarding deep dive. I feel like there's a lot of music here that I was overdue on becoming well versed in. So it's really good to dive into all these albums. And this has been a good deep dive. For all of you guys out there who have requested this over the years, thank you for your persistence because it pays off. We
Yes,
do listen.
we're there.
We will do it eventually, but we're just two men. We're just one man and two men. That's enough. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So, as always, thank you for being awesome. We'll be back soon with part 2 and part 3 of our David Bowie deep dive. And with that, I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.